Charles Joly from Chicago. I am a career bartender for 2.5 decades now. And in addition to having bartended all over the US and traveled all over the world with our spirits and cocktail industry, I have a line of bottled cocktails. I've designed a line of bar tools, both under the name Craft House. And to keep myself sane, one of my favorite hobbies is to collect and share and do some vintage barware and other vintage wares reselling, kind of spreading the love of old quality things that combine form and function and style. I don't know. I find so much fun and personality in vintage goods. I always have. I grew up with my grandparents. I feel like that may have rubbed off on me a little bit. Like there were so many old things in their home around me. I think when we look back at antique items or vintage items, they were made, just so beautifully. They weren't throwaway. And I think that people appreciate that, really the combination of form and function coming together. So few things today are made to last, to hand down. So I think people enjoy that unique gift. I think people like something that's one of a kind, something that shows that you didn't just go on to Amazon and buy it for it, and a million other people aren't getting that exact same gift this year. I think there's a little more intent. There's a lot of routes to go when it comes to vintage. And I think, of course, the first thing that comes to people's minds might be something like eBay, which is a great resource. It's a huge, obviously, global marketplace. And so you've got a bit of a one-stop shop. But that being said, there's something about having the item in your hand, being able to really see it as well, that does help. Or at least being able to talk to the curator. And you could send messages through eBay. It's a little bit clumsy. It's a little bit slow. But you definitely get a lot of a one-stop shop with that online. But there are some things you need to look out for, and we could talk about some of those as well. Etsy, of course, is another great one. And we host our shop fully on Instagram, which is a unique usage of Instagram that we're seeing a lot of resellers and people that are into hobbyists or artists or whatnot. We're using Instagram as a platform to connect to, our friends of friends, and kind of it builds by word of mouth and perhaps even through hashtags and things like that. So you might see us in your feed because you were looking up vintage barware online or something. And so our Instagram, which is @telltalevintage, might pop up. And there's lots of resellers that we've become friends with. And I like that platform because it's a bit more personal. People can DM us, they can comment in the messages, whatever it might be. We can quick and easily send them extra pictures or get a size for them or check shipping or whatever it might be. So we found that. And offline, I certainly do 99% of my shopping in person in real life. You're not going to necessarily find the best deals online, but you'll get a lot in one place. And if you need it now, I love the hunt personally. I love to go out and I love to discover things. I love to go to whether it's a flea market or an estate sale or whatnot, and kind of uncover that kind of hidden treasure, if you will. If you have the patience and that's your personality, that's a great way to do it. Flea markets are probably they're the most labor intensive, but you'll also find the best deals there. And because you've got the vendor right in front of you, they've paid a small amount to have their table there, so they don't have a lot of overhead cost involved in it. This is going to get a little bit long-winded, but when you're in person as well, you can haggle a lot easier. And haggling is part of the game, especially at flea markets. It's almost expected, depending where you are in the world, I'll say. And I plan my trips internationally around flea markets. If I have to work on a Monday or Tuesday, I'll get in on Saturday so I can get out into the weekend flea markets. And I've had great luck. Certainly in the U.S., it's expected that you're going to haggle when you're at that type of resale fair. I will say some places, like when I was in Tokyo, I went, and in culturally it was very different. They were not wanting to to talk about negotiating prices. But that is part of the fun, and you can see a huge assortment of things, whether it's obviously not just bar tools or whatnot. Now, if you want a curated assortment, that's when you look at an antique shop, that you can really find specialists in that way. You're going to pay top dollar usually when you go to a curated shop, because those people have a lot of overhead. They're paying rent every month. They have to make money. They have to make a living. And so that is for gifting and for collecting. An antique shop is a great place to go. In my preference, one step beyond that is an antique mall. Which is one building that has tons of dealers in it. You might have 30 or 50 or 200 dealers, depending on the size of the mall. You get a huge amount of diversity there. The overhead for the seller is lower in those places as well. And so the prices are usually a little bit better than they are in a standalone antique shop. Yeah, so of course it is, quality and price. It's all a balance. I mean, the other place that we can look at is auctions as well, like proper auctions, something like Sotheby's, Christie's. I don't frequent those, but I have bought vintage spirits there because they've been vetted, and that you're getting authentic wares, and that is always, it is a big thing when you are buying vintage to do your homework, especially if you're buying a more expensive item, to do some research, ask someone who knows, because there are reproductions out there, there are fakes out there, and so especially if you're buying a more high-end piece, you don't want to get duped. And that is where, like, eBay is probably the most risky place, because people, there are a lot of great sellers on some place like eBay, but there are also a lot of people out there just to make a buck. If I'm looking for something specific for my collection, then a reputable antique dealer or a reputable collector is a great way to go. I would suggest there are two sites, a couple. One of the only things I use Facebook for anymore is this online collectors community, and there's a barware collectors community that you can find very easily. There's a cocktail shaker specific one, and then there are specific pages for reselling, so you can actually purchase. On the collector pages, it's a lot of talking and back and forth and sharing information, and I just got this new piece, it's cool, I can help identify it or something. And then there's whole separate pages for selling, and then you've got this whole wealth of knowledge amongst this shared community, which is always great. And I'm sure there's pages on Reddit and other places as well that you can check out. Yeah, so there's obviously a treasure trove of information on the internet, and I find it fascinating. For me, so much of the fun about it is the history, is the origins, is the amazing designers that existed that made these pieces, that over designed these incredible pieces that today just would be cost prohibitive to make or whatnot. And these pieces are so indicative of the era. Right away when you see something that's Victorian era. You see a piece of silver plate from England that was 1880s, 1890s or whatnot, and then you can see it transition into certainly what is kind of the golden age, I would say, of the cocktail shaker, which would probably be the Art Deco era, which overlaps with Prohibition in America through the 20s, and then into the 30s really proliferates. So Prohibition ends in 33, and people were certainly drinking during Prohibition, but those designs, you would have seen in the UK, you would have seen them in France and in Italy, and certainly all over the US. So I think different parts of the world had their moments when it came to design, and America definitely had a good chunk of styles that are very, very popular through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, I would say. And then you have then that transitions into the mid-century, which is a whole nother type of collector. In the 50s and 60s, we had the style evolved, and that's very collectible as well. But I think you can, to the point where, especially the stuff in the turn of the century, you can go back and even find the original patents on it and see the original drawings on this stuff. And if there's one thing that bartenders are, we're nerds, and we love to geek out together, and so I think it's just really part of it is the conversation. talking to the vendors is like, they're there because they're social folks too, and so much of that is lost. I'll see it all the time. Someone will walk up to a vendor and immediately just pick something up and be like, how much is this? Or like, no conversation, no intro, no. If you walk in, hey, good morning, how you doing? You have a little chat with them, like they can see that you're interested, and you know questions. You're probably going to get a better price too. They're probably going to be more willing to work with you on stuff. So to me, that is part of the fun, the research. There's some great books out there. One that is a resource I couldn't dig up. I just moved, but it's out of print. It's a cocktail collecting book, but the gentleman who wrote it is actually one of the curators on the Facebook cocktail shaker collector page. So you can go straight to the horse's mouth and talk to folks there. So it's a great way to research. So when we look at vintage, like if you look at our Telltale Vintage page and kind of scroll through everything we've carried, I do this with, I do that page with myself and one of my dear friends who lives out in San Francisco. So we kind of can tag team it a little bit. And we love to put a mix of stuff. Like our stuff is not 100% bar focused, but because I'm one half of that crew, tons of cocktail related paraphernalia makes its way on there, and he's also big into spirits and cocktails as well, so it just makes its way. I mean, I like to get creative with it. So a gift for someone either you know really well or even that you don't know really well, one of my favorite things is a vintage glassware set. You can't go wrong if you give someone a set of 4 or 5 or 6 vintage crystal coupes. It's a gift that anyone's going to be happy to get, and it's going to be, they're going to be unique. They're beautiful. It's such a nice, and it's an easy gift. It's a pretty safe gift as well. Or a set of vintage old-fashioned glasses. Like anyone's going to be appreciative of that. And I don't think you need to, it doesn't need to be something huge and ornate. I think a set, and when it comes to the glassware, at least 4 is great. 6 is better. So I think glassware is a great, and it's a relatively inexpensive gift, and there's a huge range of prices that you can find on that. If you start to look into bar tools, small things like strainers or bar spoons and jiggers, of course, are a way to go. Those actually can get quite expensive and on the vintage market. With jiggers, you want to check, like, is it in ounces? Is it in mils? So depending on who you're giving it to, is it accurate? Does it have mark lines? A lot of stuff was made really beautifully and wasn't functional. How do you want to use it is an important question. Is it a piece for display, or is it a piece that you might actually want to work with? So something like, I can grab a piece here. I pulled out a few pieces. So this is an iconic German piece. It's what's known as a Zeppelin shaker. And this is actually a great example because it's also been reproduced heavily. You can find this at knockoffs of this they're not meant to trick you, but they look similar, and to the untrained eye, somebody might be like, oh, this is this vintage shaker. Like, no, it's from Pottery Barn. It was made last year. But this is a real vintage German Zeppelin shaker. It's really a cool thing. There's, in the full set, it comes in multiple pieces and down to the point where it has everything you need in it. Cups come out of it, the cup stock, it has a flask on the inside. This one is not complete. They're a bit tough and very expensive to find in their complete form. But so something like this, I'm not shaking cocktails with, just because it's even in this, even without all of its parts, something like this might be worth around $1,500. So it's a desirable shaker. So I wouldn't want to ding it up with ice and whatnot. Now I'll say, once in a while, I will carefully, because I'm like, this stuff should get used, I will carefully make a cocktail with, even with my most, I guess, pricey shakers. It also pains me when they just sit and collect dust. But if you want to use something every day, if you're going to bring it to the bar, if it's going to be handled and things, then you might want to do something a little bit less expensive. So is it going to be displayed, or is it going to be used day to day? So something a little bit more reasonable This is by Chase. Chase is a famous American company I mean, this just screams Art Deco. So really just great little design cues. The shakers of this era were huge. This thing is really gigantic. It's got to be, I don't know, 1.5 liters or something. But for something like this, you can find for around $60 in a nice shape. So I can use this. You know, this is if this gets, you know, if it gets a ding and a dent in it, okay, like, you know, and maybe you get one that isn't in perfect condition. The one that's in absolutely pristine condition, you found it in the original box from 1935. Maybe that one is for the shelf, and then you can find one for $30 or $40 that's got some dents and dings in it already, and go nuts with it and have fun with it. I love to look and repurpose things as well. I love interesting ways to put my garnish out, to stir my glasses. So something that I use a lot of, that I love, is this is a vintage caster jar. It's Victorian era, and the Victorians were notorious for having a tool for everything, absolutely everything. If you look at a Victorian place setting, there's, you know, 30 pieces of flatware on the table, and, you know, little dustpans for crumbing, and a spoon for everything. So these were pickle jars, and they have these really lovely tongs with little claw fingers, which are like super cute. So, I mean, how do I not use this for my cherries and olives on the bar top? It's just to me, it's a garnish caddy, and it's like just a really kind of sexy and fun way to do that. So I love to repurpose. One thing to think about, it's a great thing to think about, is the recipient of your gift into a particular spirit or a particular brand? Are they really into Johnny Walker Scotch? Are they really into Tanker? Whatever it is. A lot of advertising was done in spirits. It really started to tick up, and it's been happening. People have been doing advertising for over a century going back. You think about like when the Striding Man came out, but branding on things much before 1900, you don't see a lot of it, but and certainly all through the 20th century, in the 50s and 60s, it exploded. One of my favorite things I love old beer signs, and lights and whatnot, especially where I live in Chicago. Milwaukee, Wisconsin was the hotbed of brewing around the turn of the century. All of the German brewers settled there, and so Schlitz and Blatz and Pabst and Miller and just dozens of these amazing brewers were there. And in the 50s and 60s, they were all trying to outdo each other with incredible advertising pieces. And those have become highly collectible now. And so we will, like, I'll sell a lot of those lights and things that people can hang out. Again, you need to know your audience, so you don't want to show up with a giant pool table light from old style beer with someone who's not looking for it. But value, it comes down to a few things. Scarcity, it is all about supply and demand. Popularity, and it ebbs and flows. And condition is so important when it comes to antiques, and that is, again, you kind of know, it takes a little bit of research, it takes a little bit of know-how, and part of the fun of collecting and part of the fun of antiques is you're going to make some mistakes along the way. You might pick something up and it may be a reproduction. You may pick something up and it may have some damage that you didn't notice. It is part of it. But I actually pulled some cool branded stuff out as well. So these were done for Plymouth Gin back in the day. And it's this fish. It's known as a glug jug or a gurgle jug or a gurgle fish. And there's a big thing to have little porcelain water containers that you would have, and the Scotch whiskey companies did them probably more than anybody. A lot of the bourbon companies in the U.S. did them as well in the 60s. You can find these little, and they're branded, so you might find one with Four Roses or Jim Beam, or all of the Scotch companies had them, and those you can find really inexpensively, $20-$30 typically, and those are all over the place. There are some rare ones, of course, so you'll see them spike, but like something like this gurglefish or glug jug, it's got the Plymouth Gin branding on it, but when you pour it, the way that this is shaped, it actually glugs, and that's where it got the name from. It kind of the liquid kind of burps, gets an air bubble in it as you're pouring, and it made a noise, and that's where they came. But they came. This actually made in England, and then they started making them again without the Plymouth branding, but they did reproduce those. So something else that I pulled out. So an original Johnny Walker Striding Man, and these have been made for years and years and years. This one is probably from the mid to late 60s, and you'll see it's just from doing it, you'll start to know right away. So this one has a wooden base as opposed to a plastic base, so we know it's a little bit earlier. Things through the years just start to be made less expensively, less ornate. Hand-painted details will disappear in the 1980s, and things will start to become more mass production. And so the earlier stuff is more desirable. You know, I've got a couple of beautiful Beefeater statues from Beefeater Gin that are similar to this fella here, and you can really see over the years when things were made, either produced in the US or the UK, and were really hand detailed, and then when they started to mass produce, you know, some of the character and details started to go down hills. Those are going to be more common, less valuable, and it's just part of the research, kind of knowing why is this one $100 and this one's $50. If I can give a tip on kind of, if you are thinking about price consciousness and you're trying to price things, again, talking to some of these forums on Facebook or Reddit or whatnot is a great way to do it. But a great first place to search is it's where eBay becomes a great tool. You don't want to look at how the price that things are listed for. That doesn't tell us anything. I can take this and put it on eBay right now for $10,000, and so you can, if someone who didn't know can go look and be like, well, that's worth $10,000. You have to look at the sold items. And so there's a toggle on the side of eBay where you Google, you eBay search your item, you say Plymouth Gin porcelain jug, and you search that, and then all of these will come up. And then on the sidebar, you can click a little tab that toggles over that says sold items only. And then you can see what people actually paid, and that's key. It's a very valuable tool. We use it on Telltale Vintage to make sure that we are offering fair prices on things. Before I purchase something, if I know I'm going to purchase it for resale, I want to make sure that that I'm not overpaying for something. And we always will try to beat whatever it is on eBay. We try to offer 10, 15, 20% less than what that price is, and that's just the way that we do business, because we do this for fun. It's not, I'm not retiring on my vintage hobby. So we want to make sure that we always offer the best prices on our Instagram site. But that's a great way to know if you're paying in the realm. And since eBay's so massive, things will sometimes go for crazy low prices there. And so you can really see what the rock bottom is. If it's close, let me say this too, it's very long-winded. If you're in an antique shop, though, understand that if it's 15 or 20% more than you see it for on eBay, that person has an antique shop that they're paying for. eBay is somebody sitting at their house in front of the computer. So support a small business and maybe don't worry about spending the extra $5-10 for a local merchant. I think it's a great way, a great important way to do it. That's one of my other things I love vintage for too, because you're supporting all of these, little shops all over in your city or even online, Yeah, when it comes to condition, it depends on the item that you're looking at in terms of what we want to do. Let's take glassware, for example. It is ideal in way too much glassware. It's a crazy thing to do. It's fragile. So stuff can get broken. It's a lot of risk involved when I ship it. It could be damaged. I might miss a crack or something when I'm purchasing it. So you really want to take a minute when you're buying glassware. Make sure there's no chips or cracks. Chips on crystal especially can be easily sanded away by someone who knows what they're doing. So if there's just a tiny, what we would call like a flea bite, like a tiny nick on a rim of something, I can sand that away smooth, and we'll always note that too in our listing. It will not always be listing in everyone's. We're very, very thorough with that stuff, and we say this had a flea bite, it's sanded, totally safe to use, it looks great. When it comes to chrome or silver plate items and any kind of metalware, you want to look for dings and dents. Make sure all the pieces are there. So I see this shaker all the time, and it doesn't have its strainer on the inside. So not necessary to have this there, but it's one of the three pieces, and so it really affects the value. It's incomplete, and so you should pay a heck of a lot less for it. And you also don't have your strainer, so you're gonna have to use something else. You might have to grab a Hawthorne just to strain it with. This is gonna be a little, actually you can see in here, when we look in metalware, we wanna make sure that depending what we're going to use it for, if it's display, then maybe we can have some wear on the inside of this. But chrome, silver plate on the interior of these oftentimes is worn off. So when you find one that's really clean, it's a great sign. You always want to look inside, because if you're going to use it, you don't want that kind of metal alloy, whatever it is, showing. It'll get a nasty flavor into your cocktail. So it is important to make sure that it's clean on the inside, unless you're just going to display it, and then it doesn't matter. I would tell folks, especially that are just getting into this, avoid projects. I've got a million project pieces. Until you're really well versed in it, I wouldn't look at something and say, I'm going to buy this, and the plate's worn off, but I can redo the silver plate on it. It's like, well, do you have someone in line already that knows how to replate something? I would not get into projects without a little bit more know-how. But yeah, just take some time, really inspect things. Look at, if you're buying online, look at all the pictures, zoom in, and don't be afraid to ask questions as well. Yeah, I guess in terms of trends when it comes to vintage, it follows a bit of what's happening in the modern world. So for example, if I find great crystal old-fashioned glasses, I can't keep those in stock. Like, those are going to go immediately. They're in high demand because everyone's, whiskey is red hot, bourbon is red hot, the old-fashioned cocktail is on fire. So those go very, very quickly. Finding great ones is a little bit harder, so there's a little bit more rarity. On that same point, something that no one would have cared about 15 years ago, now, if I find an advertising piece from Stitzel-Weller or one of these great bourbon houses that people desire the actual liquid, but they can't find, it's impossible to find or cost prohibitive to find a $3,000 bottle of bourbon, well, you can have a little piece of advertising from that company for $50. So it's a nice piece, and those collectors will want that. I think there's some things that are always in style that we're always going to want, and places like Cocktail Kingdom have reproduced and really, really nice copies, replicas of some vintage pieces, Hawthorne strainers and jiggers and things like that. And cocktail books is another one they've reproduced. The Cocktail Kingdom, for those of us that have been shaking for a long time and remember when Cocktail Kingdom came about, they started really with reprinting cocktail books, old cocktail books, and they're beautiful and really true renditions of those books. So that being said, you got to look, because you could easily pick up one of those books. The covers look antiques and everything. You just turn into the page, to the title page, and see, and you see the print date on it. Cocktail books are always hot as well, and I think a wonderful gift to give somebody. And there's a huge range for that. You can find an old Mr. Boston's guide for $20, and those are great. There's just because there's millions of them printed. And some of the early ones are really beautiful and have some great illustrations and have really nice kind of leather-like covers, and they got a little bit generic over the years, but the ones from the 40s are great, and they're quite reasonable. And then all the way up to some of the older books can really get pricey, and books are something that I really like to have in hand or know who I'm buying from, and have that as a really thorough description, because you want to condition as everything on a book. And again, is it going to go on your shelf? Is it going to be a part of a collection, or do you want to use it? And so if a book is soiled and beat up, and I'm going to be like, I actually want to use this and have it sitting out at the bar, I don't mind if it gets splashed a little bit, then you can have a beat up copy, and then maybe you have another one. But yeah, those are fantastic. And I think every bartender, jumps on those. They're just such a cool part of our history, and a lot of them are the same regurgitated information. Especially there's an era where people just took the same recipes and kind of almost copy and pasted them. And then of course there's the hits that people are always looking for the Bon Vivant's companion, the Savoy books and things like that, where the ones that are really well known that people will always be keeping an eye out for, but those will have price. If everybody wants one, then the price is going to go that same. You know, it's going to go up, knowing that. Oh man, I'll say one of the few times that I purchased through auction, there was an old collector who was clearing out a bunch of they had just accumulated so much over time, and they were getting to a certain age, and so I have a couple of electric shakers, which are pretty rare items. I wish I would have pulled it out. It's sitting in a box, and still in my moving boxes as I'm getting settled here. But it's a huge piece from, it's got to be the teens or 20s, and way overbuilt with a huge motor in it. It violently rocks the cocktail shaker back and forth. It is so overbuilt, and it's just the way through the 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, it was the same manufacturer who would have been making power tools said, oh, for some reason decided that they were going to make a cocktail shaker. So that is pretty unusual and still works, which is great. And I've got a partner to that, which is a beautiful chrome shaker that has a mixer inside that, again, has probably a 1/4 horsepower motor or something. You could definitely whip up some Ramos Gin Fizz in there or something very quickly, I would guess. I haven't tried it yet. Once I get them all cleaned up, I'll have to do that. So there is kind of the grail of antique automatic shakers, which Tanqueray actually reproduced some of them, and you see them in bars where they've got the hand crank and they're the green cast iron, and they shake the two pieces. That is based off of an actual patent, and I think it's called the Imperial Shaker. And I don't know that any of the floor model of the Imperial Shaker are known to exist, like the original. Like, I don't know if there's any originals still hanging around, but the patents are there. And I remember years ago, like it had to be 15 plus years ago, I heard Dale DeGroff talking about it and went down a rabbit hole trying to find out about them. And then all of a sudden, Tanqueray had an artisan create these machines, which is super cool that they reproduced them, you know, in detail. Completely absurd, unnecessary, but those are the most fun things, I think. You know, you see an old absinthe fountain. It's like, do you need a obsidian pillar with, you know, silver plate statues that it's a water fountain, just drips water out of it? But when you see that in some place like the old Absinthe House in New Orleans, the original old fountains, you're like, okay, like if I ever open a bar, I'm like, yes, I want a purpose-built absinthe fountain hard plumbed into my bar top so to drip water out of course. I think a nice gift, if I were kind of just starting out, and I mean, I would, you know, it's a gift. I'd be excited about whatever somebody gave me. I think something that was usable, that could be unique, like a mixing glass or a spoon or something that I can actually put in my bar kit and bring out. Like, I know I always used to enjoy if I was doing a cocktail competition or bartending on the road or something, being able to have my unique set of tools and pull them out, whether a muddler perhaps or something like that. Again, a cocktail book, or always fun and is a little mini bottles of spirits is a nice gift. And you can find vintage mini bottles from the 60s and 70s and 80s for not very much money. You know, unfortunately, we can't get those online anymore. eBay stopped selling spirits years ago. And so it's all had to go underground, but you can find them again at like boot sales or flea markets and things like that. And I think those are nice. You kind of have a little vintage, you know, and you can even crack it open, share it together, taste it together. It's always kind of a fun gift. So vintage spirits are a really interesting topic. It's something that I'm very interested in as well. When I was back at the aviary, we started a vintage spirits collection there that's now grown, and they are still building it out, and it's massive. It's one of the bigger in the world, one of the biggest, I think, vintage chartreuse collections. Very early on, you know, in the early 2010 or whatever it was, we were doing vintage spirits there. So it's something I've been interested in for a long time. It takes a little bit more creativity to find these vintage spirits, because you can transporting, shipping is a little bit more tricky. There's some very high dollar vintage spirits, and so you really need to keep your eye out to make sure they're authentic. One thing you'll see on online sites, people will be selling empty bottles of from vintage spirits bottlings. I think some of those are going to go on a shelf to be displayed, and I think some of those are probably going to end up in more nefarious purposes and people refilling and reselling. When it comes to vintage spirits, the key is the fill line. And when we talk about the fill line, it's how full the bottle is. So if, the around the corner of the bottle, let's call that the shoulder. So a high shoulder fill, or up into the neck is even better, because that means that spirit's evaporated away out of that bottle if it was sealed. And you can find a bottle with it still, the seal is intact, and half of the liquid can be gone because it's evaporated over 30, 40, 50, 100 years, whatever it might be. I've had rye whiskey and from the early 1900s, 1906, 1907. I opened some of it, I sold some of it. Is it better? Are the old spirits better than something produced today? Not necessarily. Sometimes you can get a dud, but you're drinking a part of history. You're drinking something that is, it's when it's gone, it's gone. Some spirits I do find become brilliant over time. I got to sit in on a cherry hearing tasting where they pulled out a bottle from the 60s. They pulled out a bottle from the turn of the century. We all went to New York and did a whole we sat down for tasting notes. It was a whole thing. That got gorgeous over time. Chartreuse is one of the most desirable and sought after vintage spirits by bartenders, and the prices have actually just absolutely skyrocketed because of the demand. It gets absurdly delicious over time. They just marry, and who knows the way things were made. If extracts have worked their way into things and they were once botanicals, you're talking about something like chartreuse, so complex, right? It talks about 130 plus botanicals in that spirit. How does that evolve over 80 years? In my experience, as long as that bottle's full and hasn't evaporated away, it becomes delicious. In the case of something like a chartreuse, or we have a beautiful bar in Chicago called Billy Sunday that specializes in vintage Amari. So you go in and all these different Fernet and different Amaro bottlings, and they have from different eras, and you can really kind of do lineups on there. You can find vintage spirits at auctions online, and you can find some really cool deals there and some fun stuff. It's, of course, the stuff that everyone's looking for. Again, the prices, if you want vintage Stitzel-Weller bourbon or vintage chartreuse, you're going to pay an arm and a leg for it. But there's some great bargains to be found in things like vintage cognac, like really, to me, undervalued, and you can find some steals and get some and vintage liqueurs and things like that. Some things are just really difficult to find, that they just don't come up, because people didn't collect them as much. So there's so much vintage Scotch out there because people have collected it for forever. They've always been Scotch nerds who have been tucking bottles away. But something like tequila, people didn't in the 60s and 70s. People weren't being like, this tequila is going to be valuable at some point. So it's very rare to find vintage bottles of that. Have fun with it. Collect what you like. You have to collect what you love. If you're not enjoying a piece and it's just sitting on the shelf and it's not serving you anymore, move it down the road. With anything vintage, we are kind of the custodians of it for a time being, and then we hand it off to the next person. Don't, I guess, again, just do what you love. You can always come and check us out at Telltale Vintage on Instagram. It's Telltale, TAIL, because we donate at least 10% of all of our profits back to different animal charities, which is, so again, we're out there having fun with it. And you can always shoot us questions through our DMs there, and we'll help you out if you have questions on things, or if you're looking for something in particular as well. People will come to us with specific requests all the time, and then put us to work, and we'll go out and hunt it down for you if that's not your thing. If you're not the type of folks like to get your hands dirty and you like it a little bit more turnkey, you can always have a dealer just kind of find it for you, tell them exactly what you want.